This is Sebastian Moonjava, and today we have Checkmate, who is an on-chain analyst. This is a pretty new field, I would say. Checkmate, I'm really happy to have you here. How you doing?
Thanks, Sebastian. Great to be here. It's Real Visions. It's a great platform to get all these new ideas out. And on-chain analysis is most definitely one of those very new ideas. So, really excited to share some of the insights and thoughts I've got.
Yeah, well, before we jump into some of the work that you've been doing, I'd love to hear a little bit about your background and kind of how you got into the space, what kind of like interested you in jumping in deeper.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was one of I think I got in the way that most people do, which is by losing a stack of money. So I entered in 2018, excited by the technology and the money and all the rest of it. And I essentially learnt through the bear market about essentially how markets function and trade and all the rest of it. So my background is in civil engineering. So I've kind of got that initial, understanding of the mathematics and looking at patterns and fractals and things like that, and particularly visualizing data and trying to make fairly complex systems understandable by, the layman essentially. And the more I learned about how markets function, and then, the more I learned about the macro side of things, and really it was the macroeconomic side. And ultimately that is what Bitcoin's core role is at the moment, is we're seeing it evolve into this macro asset. And the more I learned about the sound money, the Austrian economic side of things, and just really seeing how markets actually function, it was just so addictive. And I've basically been looking at this thing ever since. And on-chain analysis was one of these fields that just kind of came onto the radar and was really just being really birthed in 2018, 2019, and brand new metrics were coming out and people were really thinking about how we use this new data. And it just fascinated me, seeing it all kind of play out in the real and recorded for all history. It's just a fascinating field, and there's just a huge amount of edge in it. So it kept me sucked in for a long time.
Yeah, in the traditional finance world, there's not so much publicly available data that anybody from any walk of life can just jump in and start studying. And I think it's amazing for opportunities for people who are trying to get familiar with what's going on. Tell me a little bit about, you said that you recently joined on with a team, and this is, I assume it's related to on-chain analysis. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, correct. So I've got a few different hats in this industry. I essentially started with a group, Reset Crypto, who I still am with. And that's essentially a community group where we try to understand more about the fundamentals of what's going on in this market. So I'll help provide our members with a whole series of on-chain analytics, and very, very soon we'll be launching a bit of a masterclass, something that people can start to dive in and understand how these metrics are actually applied in the real world, and kind of using the data and understanding what it all means. And more recently, I've joined on with Glassnode, who is a data provider for on-chain analytics, and really is trying to, very, very similar, bring a very niche product that is on-chain analytics. And to be honest, it's only niche because people don't quite understand the magnitude of what it can offer yet. And really what I'm coming on board for is to try and bring that into the, call it public consciousness, but try and show people how we can use essentially technical analysis on fundamental metrics, right? So it's, rather than the fundamentals being what is the Fed doing next week, the fundamentals of crypto assets is essentially visible on chain. And it's about how you distill that down and use all the different incentives and things of different market participants, and try and bake that into a story and understand what is the data actually telling us. So for both of those teams, it's essentially trying to bring that information, that edge, and bring it forward into more popular opinion.
Yeah, I think that before, when we had spoke previously, that you had mentioned that you believe that on-chain metrics are going to replace fundamental analysis. And then just now you had mentioned a little bit about TA, or technical analysis. Maybe for your audience, can you explain what technical analysis is, a little bit about what fundamental analysis is, and why you think that this on-chain stuff is going to basically supplement or replace some of those?
Absolutely. So from a markets perspective, technical analysis is looking at things like, support and resistance, how is price behaving? And ultimately, the way that I look at what price is it's human psychology versus time, right? It's human sentiment, how much people want to buy and sell. When you've got previous price history, it's essentially telling you that someone else will sold an asset at a particular price. So it helps provide people with a bit of a roadmap. And technical analysis is trying to find where are those levels, where has previous human psychology, and what was the sentiment or mood at that particular price level, and essentially painting that on a chart, looking for edge and opportunities. Fundamental analysis, if you go to the traditional sense, is more looking at your PE ratios, understanding relative valuations, cash flows. How is the business or the corporation performing, and using that information to say, well, relative to the current price, so you kind of combine those two elements. How are we going to value this particular entity? And is it currently overvalued, undervalued, or is there an opportunity somewhere in the longer term game? And what on-chain analysis does is it basically looks at the fundamental side of a blockchain is transaction flows. It's things like how long since a coin was last spent. It's things like how are the miners performing? What is the security mechanism doing? How is all these different elements that the blockchain is essentially publishing every block? How is all of that mapping onto the relative use? If no one's using the chain, it's probably not a great sign. If it's getting a load of use and the price is not reflecting that, perhaps there's a metric there that suggests undervaluation.
Yeah, so maybe you want to walk us through some of the examples. Like, what are the big metrics that you like to follow? What are the important data points that are available on the public blockchain?
So I like to look at on-chain analysis as something that you can prove or disprove what is going on. So obviously public sentiment and narratives are extremely powerful in markets at the moment. And probably the biggest market narrative that's been driving Bitcoin of late has been institutional flows, right? Looking at this, essentially the amount of supply that's on exchanges and balances. And with Glassnode, what they've done is they've clustered a number of these different addresses. They look at the different ways that exchanges behave. They look at coins coming in and out, and they essentially cluster them up into whether they're relatively liquid coins. And what we tend to see is that coins that moved in the last week are the most likely coins to move again. And conversely, coins that are 5 years old are extremely unlikely to move. So we can use these heuristics to essentially map out where you've got high flows, very, very liquid supplies that are essentially been taken off the market. And by monitoring exchange balances, you can actually see that we've essentially since the March sell-off back in 2020, there was just a fundamental macro shift. And we've seen an outflow from exchanges that is essentially unparalleled in Bitcoin's history. And in particular, that's looking at the liquid supply, or the coins that have essentially moved within the last 12 months, has more or less collapsed. And we're seeing more and more of these coins being pulled out and put into addresses that all have heuristics of long-term holding. So it really has been a fairly remarkable trend. It's been over a year now, and we've just never seen this before. And we're talking about over 20% of supply has essentially been pulled off exchanges within a 12-month period, which is quite remarkable.
So what you just described here, is that related to this slide called Bitcoin's supply dynamics? Is that what you were just touching on?
Correct. So we're looking at essentially the clustering of those coins into highly liquid or liquid coins, and there's a distribution and a process in which how they get clustered into that form. And then the rest of the supply, which is hidden from this chart, but that's essentially the illiquid supply, or coins that really haven't moved. And if you were to plot that as well, you almost can't see the orange and the red portions of this chart, because there's so much liquid supply that is currently expanding. So it really is suggesting that on chain we do have this supply squeeze that's coming in. And I think the most important part about this whole trend is the point at which it started, which really was that March sell-off back in the liquidity event back in 2020. Essentially, from that point on, the narrative of Bitcoin as a macro hedge, I think, has really taken root. And what we're seeing is that is actually being expressed in the behavior on chain. I find that to be quite remarkable.
Hey, if you like this clip, be sure to like and subscribe for more crypto-related content. Also, be sure to check out the full interview and more only on realvision.com/crypto.